Welcome to church, everyone. We're happy to have you here. And I'm excited to share a message with you today titled, Fixin Your Stinkin Thinkin. Fixin Your Stinkin Thinkin. I think that at this time of year, we have a lot on your minds. Isn't that true, church? That we are starting new things. In a funny way, the fall always feels like more of a new year than New Year's is a new year. And so just as kids are going back to school, you might be starting new positions at work. You might be coming back from vacations after taking some time off in the summer. And I think that at this time of year, there's just a lot on our minds. There's a lot that we're thinking about. And so that's what I want to talk about today, is not the things going on around us, but what's going on within us. I want to talk about fixing our stinking thinking. But first, let's pray real quick. Jesus, we just thank you for this day. God, we thank you that you're with us and that you're for us. God, we thank you that you have good plans, good intentions on our lives, that you work all things according to your purpose. And so, Jesus, in these next 30 minutes or so that we have together, Lord, would you just help us to walk out of this room with a deeper understanding of how deep your grace and your love is. In your name we pray. Everybody said, amen. Amen. Well, hey, if you have missed the last couple of weeks, we're actually just coming back from something pretty exciting here. A couple of weeks ago, we had our youth camp. Come on. And we have been running youth camp for over 10 years now, which is crazy. But camp for me has really been the highlight of my year. I mentioned that we've been running camp for over 10 years. And through all of those, in one capacity or another, I've had the pleasure, the opportunity of being involved in it. And if you were to ask the majority of our young adults, the ones who grew up in this church who used to be youth, where did your faith become your own? Like, where did Jesus transform your life? I think that for about 90% of those people, they would say youth camp. That youth camp has consistently been the space where people encounter Christ, they get filled with the Holy Spirit, and it just changes the trajectory of their life. So if you didn't sign up for camp this year, don't worry, next year is only a year away. But I want to share with you some funny stories from camp, because while there are some very meaningful things that happen at camp, there's also a lot of chaos that happens at camp. There's this thing that happens when you take 130 teenagers and you just put them in rooms together for a full week. That chaos ensues, all right? There are hijinks, there are pranks. For some reason this year, there were frogs. I don't know why. I don't actually know where it started. I think that one kid just found a frog, and then it was like everybody had frogs. And we're walking through the cabins, and there's Gatorade bottles filled with frogs. And just like dozens of frogs being kept in people's cabins. And every time that someone would lose in a game, or they'd get upset with someone on the opposite team, they're like, I'm going to frog your cabin, and then go dump a dozen frogs in their cabin. And it's just like the things that happen at youth camp. But there's one story from youth camp. This wasn't this year, but this was about 8 years ago that stands out in my mind. And as the week of camp was going on, there was one of the cabins there that just stunk. Like, I mean, this cabin smelt atrocious. And I don't know what you're thinking, like, Ben, you have 9 teenage boys in one room. What do you expect it to smell like? And granted, that is true. Usually a lot of Axe body spray. That's usually what it smells like. But this was worse. This just was like an odor building up day after day after day. And we were at a loss as to where this smell was coming from. And the cabin was like digging through everything that they could find, trying to figure out, like, why does our room smell so bad? And I remember they like had one guy in their cabin. They were convinced that it was his feet. And so they had this poor camper just like with his feet in the sink, washing his toes, scrubbing his heels, just trying to get his feet as clean as possible. They're getting rid of his socks. They're making him store his shoes outside. And still their cabin just stinks, and it stinks. They're unloading just can after can of deodorant, trying to get this cabin to smell somewhat like a teenage boy. And until finally it's the last day of camp. And we always spend a lot of time on the last day just cleaning up the cabins, that we want to make sure that our space is left better than we found it. And so we're going in every nook and cranny, trying to just like get it as clean as possible before we wrap up for the week. When on the top shelf of one of the cabinets, we find this bucket. And we take this bucket down, and we find this bucket, to our horror, is filled with not one, not two, but over a dozen dirty diapers. And we're like, what is going on? And we realized that one of our volunteers that week had brought his 9-month-old daughter to camp, and that someone had been taking the dirty diapers and sneaking them day after day after day into these boys' cabin until finally it was just compounding into like this chemical war zone. But anyways, I say that for a reason, okay? I say that for a reason, and it's not just to like plant ideas in all of our teenage boys' minds. So like, oh, next year I gotta bring a baby to camp. No, don't bring a baby to camp. But I say this because it's a funny thing to me that all it took in a massive cabin was a couple of dirty diapers in the corner to completely change the atmosphere of that room. All it took was a couple of dirty diapers to completely change the atmosphere of that room. And I wonder sometimes if the same can be true of our minds. That sometimes all it takes is a couple negative thoughts. I don't know about you. Do you ever get stuck on a feeling? Or stuck on a thought? I know I do sometimes. It's like just something you hear on the radio as you're driving to work, and it like triggers this fear. And you just get stuck on it. And you're trying to go about your day, you're trying to like just go about your normal routine, but you're stuck on it. It's in your mind, or it's maybe something that someone said to you. It's like a criticism that you got from a boss, or it's like an argument that you got into with a family member, and it just sticks with you. And you try and move on, but it has this way of just like rearing its head. And in your motivations, in your actions, in your relationships, it's just like it's permeating through, and similar to a bucket of dirty diapers. Changing the atmosphere of a cabin, I wonder sometimes if we have these thoughts that we get stuck on that have a way of changing the atmosphere of our minds. I like to call this a case of stinkin' thinking. A case of stinkin' thinking. Church, are you here today, and are you caught up in a case of stinkin' thinking? My question to you is this: how is your mind? That if you're to take like a self-audit of yourself, how is your thought life? Do you have a case of stinking thinking this morning? Check it out. It says this in 2 Timothy 1:7. It says that for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of self-control. A lot of other translations, the New King James or some of the others, that word self-control is translated as sound mind. But if you look at it in the original Greek, it comes from this word. I'm going to butcher how it's said. I hope we have no Greek scholars here to rebuke me afterwards. But I know how I could spell it for you. But it's a word called sophronismos. Sophronismos. And what this word is derived from is from two other words. The first being sos, which means safe, and the second being phren, which is thinking. So essentially what this passage is saying, what Paul is writing to Timothy, is he's saying that God has not given you a spirit of fear, that God has not given you a spirit of stinking thinking, but of power and of love and of safe thinking. Now, if I was to take like an anonymous poll of this room, and you're to really reflect like, where are my thoughts at? How is my mind? Would you consider your thought life to truly be a safe place? Safe thinking. That the promise of God's Spirit is a spirit of safe thinking. But for many of us in this room, I would argue that our minds feel less like a safe place and maybe more like a cabin suffering from the chemical warfare of some dirty diapers in the closet. And so it begs the question that if this is not the way that God designed us to think, then why is that the way that we think? The question becomes, why do we think the way we think? Why do we get caught up in a case of stinking thinking? That if God designed our mind to be a safe place, then why does it sometimes feel like a war zone? See, I believe that oftentimes the health of our minds, or rather the stinking of our thinking, isn't based on what's going on around us, but could it actually be based on what's happening within us? That many times what it comes down to, the reason why we think the way that we think, is not because of what we're facing or what we're in, but it's the way that we see it. It's the perspective of it. Check this out. In James chapter 1, verse 2, it says this: consider it. Someone say consider it. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. This is an interesting passage. What does James say in this passage? He doesn't say, run away as fast as you can when you encounter trials of any kind. He doesn't say avoid conflict at all costs and never let anything scary ever happen in your life. Turn off your radio, blot your ears, put earplugs in, and just hide in a cave until everything is peaceful, right? That's not what James is saying. He's not saying get a cabin in the woods and get off the grid and just avoid all of the anxiety in your life. What does he say instead? He says, consider it. That James is commanding us not to have an avoidance of our issues, but a change of perspective of our issues. Consider it all joy. See, here's the reality of the Christian life is that you can't pick your situation. You can't pick your situation, but you can pick your perspective. You can't pick your situation, but you can pick your perspective. And what is your perspective? Your perspective is not what happens around you. Your perspective is what happens within you. That maybe the issue of our stinking thinking is not due to our experiences, but rather the way that we're looking at them. In fact, I would say that a significant part of Jesus' teaching that we see in the Gospels is actually just devoted to changing people's point of view. That if you take something like the Sermon on the Mount, that what's that line that Jesus says over and over and over again is he says, you have heard it said, but I say to you. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Get all the vengeance that you can. But I say to you, what is he doing? He's changing their point of view. But I say to you that if your enemy slaps you on one cheek, offer them the other also. That if you're asked to go 1 mile, go a second mile also. What is Jesus offering? Jesus is offering a different point of view. We don't just see this in the Sermon on the Mount. We see it in some of his I am statements too. There's this one passage where the people bring up the manna. Right? That in the book of Exodus, God brings down manna from heaven to supply the people's needs as they're wandering through the wilderness. And they're asking like, will God do something like that again? And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. What's he doing in this passage? Is he's offering them a new way of looking at things. That you're looking at the literal bread that God rained down from heaven, but he's saying, hey, look at me instead. I am the bread of life. What is Jesus doing? He's offering a new perspective. You see, sometimes I think that we think the way we think because we don't think about what we think. Let me say that again. Sometimes we think the way we think because we don't think about what we think. We just go into mental autopilot. You know what I mean? Where you just kind of like, your mind just sort of takes control and you sort of just like slip into whatever thought just kind of seems the most convenient. I remember a couple years ago, Laura and I, we used to live over here in like Douglasdale, Quarry Park area, and then we bought a house in Deer Run. And so when I'm driving home from my parents' house, basically what I have to do is I have to go one exit further on Glenmore than I used to. And the amount of times, guys, I cannot count the amount of times where I'm driving home from my parents' house and I just like automatically turn off and go back to my old house, right? How many times have you guys done that? Or you like convince yourself, you're like, I'm gonna run this errand and this errand and this errand after work, and I'm gonna make this stop, and then you get in your car, and then all of a sudden you're pulling into your driveway, and you're like, wait, no! And your brain had just turned off, and you completely forgot about all the things that you're supposed to do, that we just go into autopilot. And I think that the same is sometimes true with our thinking, is that we just go into mental autopilot, that I just think the thoughts I think because they're just the thoughts that I think. But maybe what we need to do is start thinking more about the things that we think and recognize that we are not victims to our thoughts. We are the masters of our thoughts. That we are not victims to our minds. We are the owners of our minds. Check this out. In 1 Corinthians 2:16, it says this, that for who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have, someone say, we have the mind of Christ. What does that mean? That means it's not just your mind anymore. It's his mind too. It's not just your thoughts anymore. It's his thoughts too. And so maybe what we need to do is choose a new perspective. And not just see things the way we want to see things or we hope to see things, but change our perspective and start seeing things the way that God sees things. That maybe what we need is a shift not of our situation, but what we need is a shift of our perspective and to broaden our point of view and see our situations. That maybe you're in this room and you feel like, man, my dreams just have not been actualized. That I felt like I had this plan for my life. I had this idea for my life, for my business, for my career, for my relationships, and it's just not panning out the way that it's supposed to look. Maybe what you need is not for something around you to change, but something within you to change. And to look at that situation not as God being this magic genie in the sky, as a means to our own end, as a means of fulfilling our plan, but rather to start seeing ourselves as a piece of God's plan and where we fit in what He's doing on the earth. That maybe what we need is not a shift of what's going on around us, but a shift of what's within us. That maybe you're in this room and you're just frustrated at your boss. And you're thinking, man, tomorrow's Monday, but it's a long weekend, so it's not really Monday. It's kind of like an extra Sunday, but then the day after that is Tuesday, and I don't want to see him again. And those coworkers who just keep sending me Teams messages when I'm trying to do something else, and they want me and blah, 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 blah. I'm mad. I'm grumpy, right? We all get that way sometimes. I get it. But maybe what we need is to stop seeing the people in our lives as a means to our own end and instead see them, again, the way that God sees them, as a people to be loved. It's not a shift of what's going on around me. It's a shift of what's happening within me. Maybe somebody criticized you. Maybe a family member made a critique of you, and it's just rubbing you the wrong way. And you're just jaded, and you're angry, and you're upset. Maybe what we need is not to get even, is not to rub something in their face too. But maybe rather than receiving that as an attack on our own character, we need to see it instead as an improvement we can make to an area of our life that we might be blind to. That what is the difference between these things is it's not what's going on around us, it's what's going on within us. It's a shift of perspective. It's a shift of perspective. And so how do we do that? How do we shift our point of view? How do we begin to look at things not as I see them, but as God sees them? I want to give you 2 simple tips today, 2 simple steps. And the first one is this. The first one is ownership. That if we want to change the way we think, we have to own the way we think. It says this in 2 Corinthians 10:5, that we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive. We take every thought captive into the obedience of Christ. That what does this verse imply? It says that we take every thought captive. What does that mean? This verse speaks to who has authority over your mind. See, I think like this. Like I mentioned, a couple years ago, Laura and I bought a house. And I wish that you could have seen the walls of that house when we first bought it. Because whoever owned the house before us, we never got the chance to meet them. I would have really loved to, though, because they must have really loved blue. Because everything was blue. Like everything was blue. And not just blue. You can have some nice shades of blue. This was like, you know when you drive past a handicap sign and they make it so blue that you can't miss the blue? It's like the point of the blue is to make the blue stand out so that like even in the dark, you're like, oh yeah, that's blue. I can't park there. That's the color of blue that our house was. And so we buy this house, and when we sign the deed of this home, guys, do you know what we do? We don't leave the walls that color, right? We don't just think to ourselves, well, I mean, the guys before us must have really liked it. They were really into blues, so, I mean, I don't want to, like, tread on their territory. No, the first thing we did when we moved into that house is we went straight to the hardware store, and we got tarps, and we got paint, and we didn't even care what color the paint was, just whatever covers up blue the best, right? And we just slathered our wall with as much paint as possible to cover up that blue in our home. Why? Because it's our home. It's my home. And so my friends and my family and my guests, they can have opinions over the colors of my walls. And they can have opinions over the arrangement of my furniture. And they can have opinions over how we design things or what we hang on the walls. But at the end of the day, whose decision is it? Who has final say? I do. Because it's my house. It's not their house. It's my house. And I think that in a similar sense, we need to remind ourselves, whose mind is this? That this mind does not belong to the enemy. That my mind does not belong to my fears. That my mind does not belong to the news. That my mind does not belong to the number in my bank account. That my mind does not belong to the criticism that I've received. That my mind does not belong to the people who treated me unfairly. My mind is my mind. And so I take every thought captive into the obedience of what? Into the obedience of Christ. What does that mean? That means my fear, my insecurity, my anxiety, they don't just have to answer to me. They have to answer to Him. If we want to start rethinking the way we think and think about the things we think, if we want to deal with our stinking thinking and get the dirty diapers out of the closet of our minds, we have to own it. We have to own it. That we can't outsource the responsibility of our own thought life. We have to own our minds. Ownership. How do we shift our perspective? We have to own it. And the second thing is this, is action. Step one, ownership. And step two, I'm keeping it simple for you today, is action. See, I think that sometimes we have things in our lives where we take no action to change and then we wonder why nothing happens, right? How many people, I'm gonna get in shape. Well, have you worked out? Have you started eating healthy? Well, no, but I want to, right? We take no action to change and then we wonder why things stay the same. Here's the reality, is that dealing with our stinking thinking isn't something that's gonna happen passively. It's not something that happens passively. It's something that happens intentionally. That we have to take ownership and then we have to take action. We have to be intentional about changing the way we think. It says this in Romans 12:2. It says this, do not be conformed to this world. What does that mean, to not be conformed? That means don't let the world shape what you believe. Don't let the world shape what you believe, but be transformed. Someone say transformed. By the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. What is this verse saying? It's saying that we can be transformed by what? The renewing. What does it mean to renew our mind? It doesn't mean just eliminate the old thoughts. It means replace them with something new. Renew. Renew your mind. See, if I just told you, hey, don't think about elephants, what is the first thing that you're going to think of? Is elephants. That sometimes it's not enough. We get this in our head that it's like, well, I'm just not going to think about those things anymore. But the more that we try to not think about the things we don't want to think about, the more we end up thinking about the things we don't want to think about. And so what we need to do is not just stop thinking about the old, we need to start intentionally, someone say intentionally, thinking about the new. And I think that the best thoughts that we can think are not the things that I think about me, but what God thinks about me. That what we need to remind ourselves of is, again, whose mind is it? That yes, it's my mind, but it's not just my mind. For we have the mind of Christ. And so my mind is best when it's not just me looking in the mirror and I'm going to give myself some positive affirmations today, right? That I'm going to flex. I'm going to say, Ben, you're so strong and you're so handsome and you're so great, right? Like we can have positive vibes in the morning and that's great. And I encourage you to try and be positive about yourself. But ultimately, if we want to renew our minds, it's not a matter of me just thinking positive things about myself. It's filling my mind with what God thinks about me. Renew your mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I remember a number of years ago, kind of like in that season when I had just graduated high school, and I was trying to think about what that next step in my life was. It was kind of like a funk for me in those years. I wouldn't say it was like a depression. It wasn't like anything diagnosable, but it was just a funk. I wouldn't say I felt super sad, but I wouldn't say I felt super happy. I kind of just felt numb. I felt low. And at this time, I was working for Napa Auto Parts. And I remember just like I would drive around in this truck and I would just like be thinking about what all my friends are doing and how they're traveling or they're going to university and just feeling like, what am I even doing with my life? And I was stuck in a case of stinking thinking. And it's funny because despite being the kid who grew up in Sunday school, who lived on Veggie Tales and all those, felt boards and Sunday school things and all that sort of stuff, this was the first time in my life that I actually made a decision to be like, I'm going to try and read my Bible. And I opened up my Bible, and it wasn't so much the studying of my Bible that transformed my life. But what I started doing is as I would read, is I would just take specific verses and I would commit them to memory. That whenever there was a verse that would just stand out to me, I would write it down in this little notebook and I would keep it with me. And so again, at this time, I was delivering car parts for Napa Auto Parts. And so I'd spend 8 hours a day just by myself in a truck with my own thoughts. And I'd just be driving around and driving around and driving around. And what I started to do in that season is I started to take these verses that I had memorized, and I would just use that time to start speaking them over my life. That the Lord is my light and my salvation. Of whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And guys, the craziest thing started to happen is that I would start a day with all of these stinking thoughts in my head. These thoughts of where I'm falling short, these thoughts of what I'm not doing, of who I'm not being, of where I'm comparing to all of my friends. And as I would work my way through this confession, it would shift something. And it wouldn't just shift what was going on around me, but man, it would shift what was going on within me. That I would start this confession over my life. That it's no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live, I live by faith. That though I'm hard pressed on all sides, I am not crushed. Perplexed, but I'm not in despair. That I would just start working my way through these verses. And what would happen is that I would start this confession being like, man, I'm making a waste of my life. Man, I'm not doing anything with my life. To by the end, I'm like, I am an ambassador of Jesus Christ. And any auto shop I go into in this city, I'm making a difference in these people's lives. That all of a sudden, what started changing was it wasn't anything that was in me. That it wasn't like that truck suddenly became like a shuttle thing of a missionary, but it was just something within me started to stir. Something within me just started to come alive. Something within me just started to burn. And what happened, it didn't come at anything external. It came at filling my mind with who God had called me to be. That's what made the difference. We are transformed, you guys. We are transformed by the renewing. Someone say the renewing of our minds. That I would go into this confession feeling like a bag of dirty old diapers in a teenage boy's cabin at camp. And I would walk out on the other side without fail with thankfulness. That every single time on the other side of this confession was gratitude. And here's the crazy thing about thankfulness. Here's the crazy thing about gratitude. There was this study that was done a couple of years ago. And they took scans of people's brains as they were thinking anxious thoughts and then as they were thinking grateful thoughts. And the crazy thing was that the same part of their brain that lights up when you're feeling anxious is the same part of your brain that lights up when you're feeling grateful. And so what this means is that anxiety and gratitude are mutually exclusive. That while you are feeling anxious, you cannot feel thankful at the same time. And while you are thankful, you cannot feel anxious. That they are mutually exclusive feelings. And check this out, in Philippians 4, it says this, to not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Isn't it cool when science catches up to the Bible? Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ. What is a peace that surpasses all understanding? It is a peace that is based not on what is going on out here, but it is a peace that's found in here. It's a peace that we have regardless of our circumstances. It's a peace we have that supersedes our circumstances. And it comes through the action of thankfulness. And so how do we shift our perspective? How do we deal with our stinking thinking? How do we clean out the dirty diapers in the closet of our mind? We got to be thankful. We have to be grateful. And I get it, because sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it feels like there is just a wall between us and gratitude. And so what makes it so hard to be grateful? What makes that difficult to be thankful? I remember even in that season of my life where God was doing this work in me, that there were days where I would wake up and I'd just be full of stinking thinking. I'd feel low, I'd feel bummed out, and I knew that if I took these verses and as I was driving, if I spoke that confession out, I knew that it would transform my mind. I knew that it would, but there were some days where I just went, I kind of just don't want to, right? I kind of just want to wallow in this. Sometimes I think we take comfort in our pity. There's some days where it was a lot easier than fixing my stinking thinking to distract myself from my stinking thinking. To just throw on a hockey podcast or throw on some music and just put something on instead to pass the time instead of dealing with the way that I feel. That sometimes it feels like there's just this divide, that there's this gap between where I am and the gratitude that I know I'm supposed to have. And so what makes this so hard? I want to read one last passage of scripture for you. It says this in Matthew 26. It's a story of this woman who comes up to Jesus with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment. And she takes it and she pours it on the head of Jesus as he reclined at the table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble this woman? She has done a beautiful thing for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. And pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." So we find in this passage a woman who is so overwhelmed, so overcome with gratitude, that she takes the most expensive, the most valuable thing that she has in her possession. She takes this alabaster flask of perfume. Some suggest that this cost as much as a year's worth salary for her. And she takes it and she pours it on Jesus. She pours it out on him, and in her act of worship, in her act of praise, in her act of thankfulness, what happens? She changes the atmosphere of that room. They can imagine as she pours that ointment out, the fragrance hitting the people in that space. I think that when we make a choice of worship, I want to key in on that word choice, because here's what worship isn't. Worship is not a feeling. Worship is not a vibe. Worship is not like a couple of tingles that you get down your spine when the worship team sings. What is worship? Worship is a choice. It's a decision that we make. That when we make this choice of worship, I believe that like this woman's act of pouring out this ointment upon Jesus, that we have the power and we have the ability to lift the atmosphere of our minds. And what once was a case of stinkin' thinkin' is now replaced with a beautiful aroma of praise. It's a choice. And so what makes that choice so difficult? See, here's the thing that I think makes it a challenge, is that it cost her something. Is that yes, this woman's worship changed the atmosphere of that room, but it came at a price. That when she poured that oil out, the disciples were shocked. And I know if it was me, I would be shocked too. But for me, it'd be like, oh my gosh, that's going to leave such a big stain on the carpet. There's oil, guys. You can't just scrub oil out of... Anyways, stressful. Having a baby is hard. It's really taking a toll on me, guys. I was scrubbing the floor for an hour yesterday. Sweet potato crusts. It's crazy. It's like splatters on the walls, and you have to scrape. Anyways, I'm way off track. These disciples are shocked, but they're not shocked at the mess. What are they shocked at? What do they say? Why this waste? They're shocked at the price. This could have been sold. Do you know how much this cost? You could have sold this and given it to the poor. They're shocked at what it cost her. But here's the thing about thankfulness. And here's the thing about praise. Here's the thing about gratitude, is that it comes at a price. And it might not be a price of an alabaster jar of ointment, but I think it costs us something nonetheless. It says this in Hebrews 13:15, that through him let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise. I think that's a really interesting term. Let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise. That what do these two words mean? That traditionally to sacrifice something is to lay something down. Is to give something up. Is to take your hands off of it. And to praise something is to lift something up. And so these two terms, a sacrifice of praise, they feel like they should be at odds with one another, but I think that the two work in perfect synergy. That sometimes what makes gratitude so hard, what makes thankfulness so difficult, is that sometimes in order to lift something up, it means we have to let something go. And that the thing that we have to let go might not just be a jar of perfume, but maybe what we need to let go of today is a case of stinking thinking. Why is it hard to let go of stinking thinking? Because sometimes it means letting go of our pride, letting go of our fear, letting go of our insecurity. Sometimes it means letting go of our control, of the things that we can hold in our own hand and be confident that we can change, I can change it. That sometimes our thankfulness comes at the cost of letting go of our justice, of letting go of getting even about something. But in doing so, we lift up something greater. And what we see in this passage is that what others saw as a waste, and sometimes it feels like a waste to let go of control. Sometimes it feels like a waste to let go of our fear. Sometimes it feels like a waste to let go of our justice, our vengeance, our getting evenness. But what the disciples saw as a waste, Jesus saw as worship. And when she laid those things down, it changed the atmosphere of that space. So church, are you here today and you need to deal with some stinking thinking? I want to encourage you today that we lift him up because he first laid himself down. It says this in Ephesians 5:2, to walk in love as Christ first loved us and gave himself up as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Do you feel like your life stinks? Do you feel like you've got a case of not just stinking thinking, but stinking living? Does it feel like in the various aspects of your world, like there are some dirty diapers in the closet? I want to assure you today that when you invite Jesus into those spaces, it changes the atmosphere. That a relationship with him is like a case of spiritual deodorant. It doesn't just cover up the dirty diapers in the closet, it cleans them out. Anyone who is in Christ is a new creation, not a covered up creation, not a sprayed with Axe body spray creation, not a washing a camper's feet creation, a new creation. God doesn't just deal with the dirty diapers in the corner of the cabin, he gives you a whole new room. For anyone who is in Christ is a new creation. That old things, old stinking thinking, old thoughts, old fears, old feelings are passed away, and behold, all things are new. This is the beauty of the gospel. We love because he first loved us. And I want to assure you today, church, that you may have heard it said that you've got to check off a to-do list and you've got to do all these things to know that you have peace with God. But the beauty of this faith is that it's not based in what we do, it's based in what he's done. What has he done? He gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering.